What if the static you see on an old, untuned television screen, that fuzzy black and white snow, what if that is actually the physical floor of the throne room of God?
I mean, it is quite the image to start with, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
But that is exactly the kind of massive perspective-shifting claim we're unpacking today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are the kind of person who loves connecting the dots between ancient history, deep space, and modern biology, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we are basically tearing up the floorboards of the universe.
We really are.
Yeah, we're looking at a completely fascinating source text today. It's a book called Creation Through Art. It's actually the second volume in the three-part Through Art series, written by the Amazon best-selling author and theologian, Craig Speakman.
And, Speakman is a really intriguing figure to follow right now.
Yeah.
After the success of his debut book, which was highly focused on the Second Advent, he and his wife, Amber, who also serves as his editor, by the way, they did something really interesting.
Where they moved, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. They packed up and relocated to the rugged, sweeping, high desert landscapes of Idaho. And I have to say, when you read this second volume, you can almost feel that expansive, unyielding environment influencing the sheer scale of the ideas he tackles.
Oh, absolutely.
It is a book that just looks at the big open sky and asks some incredibly heavy questions.
You really can feel that landscape in the text. And his writing style is, well, it's highly distinct. The promotional materials and the reviews, they describe it as having this signature linguistic grit.
Linguistic grit. That is a great way to put it.
I love that phrase. It's so conversational, it's high velocity, and it just fearlessly blends deep theology with astrophysics and macrogeology. His ultimate goal in this book, the whole mission of it, is to shatter what he calls spiritual paranoia.
Yes. And to achieve that, to get rid of that paranoia, he constructs this highly structured, unified framework. He connects cosmic origins, genetic degradation, and spiritual architecture all together.
It's massive.
It really is an attempt at a unified theory of everything. I mean, he's tracing a straight line from the literal edge of the universe to the synthetic preservatives sitting in your pantry right now.
Now, before we jump into how he actually builds this universe, I do want to set the table for you, our listener. Speakman makes incredibly bold, frankly controversial claims that challenge both secular scientific consensus and, honestly, traditional theological norms.
Very much so.
So our job today isn't to take a side. We're not here to endorse these views or to tell you what to believe in these highly charged religious or scientific debates. We are just here to put his framework under a microscope.
Exactly. We want to fully immerse you in his intricate perspective, piece by piece, and just show you exactly how the gears of his argument turn.
Right. We are examining the architecture of his argument. We want to understand the how and the why of his conclusions based strictly on the text provided. It's just a fascinating exercise in paradigm shifting, regardless of where you personally land on the spectrum of these debates.
So, if we are going to understand Speakman's view of human history and ultimately our biological reality today, we actually can't start on Earth.
No, we have to go way further out.
The text demands that we start at the absolute, literal edge of the universe with the mechanics of day one of creation. So, in the Genesis account, God says, "Let there be light." But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
Right. Speakman argues that this light was absolutely not the sun. Because, the sun, the moon, the stars, none of those are created until day 4 in this text.
So if it's not a star, what on Earth, or I guess what in space, was the light on day 1?
Speakman proposes that this initial light was the creation of a definitive physical structural architecture for the cosmos. He describes it as God pushing his uncreated glory outward to form a protective boundary of raw energy.
Okay, wait. Let's try and visualize this.
Yeah, imagine an empty, infinite, dark void. God's presence, which Speakman describes as this uncreated, eternal light, just flashes into being and pushes outward like a massive shockwave. And it carves out this gigantic three-dimensional expanse. Speakman calls this a dark pavilion.
A dark pavilion.
Exactly. And it is perfectly framed and insulated by this boundary wall of fiery energy.
Okay, let me try an analogy here. So it's like a cosmic quarantine tent, or maybe a better way to picture it, for me at least. Think of the universe like a massive dark aquarium. The water inside is the blackness of space, but the glass walls holding it all together are made of raw, uncreated glory.
That's a great way to think about it.
That is the light of day 1, the boundary itself. And Speakman claims this isn't just some ancient poetic metaphor, right? He claims we can actually see this wall today with modern technology.
He does, and that is one of his boldest scientific connections in the entire book. He argues that what secular astrophysicists observe as the cosmic microwave background radiation, or the CMBR, is exactly this boundary.
The CMBR. Okay, so for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, the CMBR is a literal wall of raw heat and background radiation that's detected at the absolute furthest edges of deep space. It literally encloses the entire known observable universe.
Right. And traditional secular astrophysics views this as the fading echo, the residual heat of the Big Bang.
But Speakman says no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Speakman says this isn't just random space noise or the cooling embers of a cosmic explosion. He argues it is the physical footprint of God's original day one light wall. It marks the exact, literal boundary line where our physical universe ends and the uncreated eternal realm begins.
Wow. If you're pausing your run or your commute right now to wrap your head around that, you are definitely not alone. What Speakman is asking you to do is essentially flip your entire spatial awareness upside down.
Completely.
So if the cosmic microwave background radiation is the physical barrier of this dark pavilion, how does the rest of the universe and, God's domain fit together inside that?
To explain that spatial relationship, Speakman breaks down reality into a three-dimensional structure of the heavens. And this is incredibly helpful to visualize, especially if we break it down simply. Like almost how you would for a young student who is trying to map this out spatially for a science or theology project.
I love that approach. Keep it simple.
Right. He argues that the biblical text presents three distinct consecutive dimensions of space.
Okay, let's walk through those systematically. The first heaven, what is the mechanism there?
The first heaven is our immediate atmosphere. Think of it as the physical envelope wrapped tightly around the Earth. It's where the birds fly, where the weather systems operate, where the clouds form.
Okay, got it.
It is the literal layer of oxygen and gases that acts as our immediate biological life support system. That is the first dimension of the heavens.
That makes perfect sense. So if I get in a rocket and I punch through that atmosphere, I enter the second heaven.
Precisely. The second heaven is the stellar expanse. This is what we colloquially call deep space.
Right.
It's the massive, seemingly infinite canvas inside the cosmic pavilion that contains the planets, the solar systems, the black holes, the nebulas, and the billions of spinning galaxies. It is the entire observable physical universe that we explore with our telescopes and our satellites.
Okay, and then we keep going, past the galaxies, past the furthest quasars, until we hit the wall. The CMBR, the edge of the aquarium. What is beyond that?
That brings us to the third heaven. According to Speakman's framework, the third heaven is the transcendent, uncreated throne room of God. It exists entirely outside, above, and beyond our physical cosmos and the time-space continuum.
So it's outside of physics?
Exactly. It is not governed by entropy or gravity or time.
I have to say, the visual mechanics he uses to explain this boundary between the second and third heaven, they are just stunning. He points to verses in the books of Ezekiel and Revelation where the ancient prophets describe seeing the throne room of God, and they say it has a sea of glass like crystal.
Yes, and the perspective shift here is brilliant. Speakman says that if you are standing in the third heaven, in this uncreated realm, looking inward at our universe, that boundary wall appears as a perfectly transparent, crystal clear sea of glass. It's essentially a floor.
A floor of glass.
Right. God can look straight down through this crystal floor and see the entire physical expanse, all the galaxies and planets nestled safely inside this pavilion.
But if you are on Earth, trapped inside the second heaven, looking outward with a high-powered telescope, you're looking at the bottom of the floorboard.
Exactly. You are looking at the exact same floor, but from the underside. And here's the why behind the physics of it. Because a raw presence of God in that throne room radiates a consuming fire of infinite glory. The underside of that crystal floor manifests to our physical scientific instruments as a blisteringly hot, uncrossable wall of background radiation.
So the CMBR isn't a fading echo.
No, it is the fiery outer lining of the pavilion shielding the universe from the uncreated light.
That is just a wild image to hold in your mind. The edge of the universe is the underside of the floor of the throne room. But, Speakman doesn't just use this as a cool astronomy fact to wow the reader. He actually uses this strict architectural layout to push back against certain theological misconceptions of the afterlife.
He does.
Specifically, he contrasts this spatial architecture against the Latter-day Saint or Mormon teaching of a multi-tiered afterlife.
He does. And just to be impartial here, we're simply looking at how Speakman uses his architectural model to critique another model. So the Latter-day Saint theology teaches that eternity is divided into three separate kingdoms of glory: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial kingdoms.
Right, the three tiers.
Yes, and access to these tiers in their framework is based on a sliding scale of human works, obedience to specific laws, and temple performance. Speakman characterizes this system as essentially an eternal high-rise, where humanity is separated onto different floors based on what they've earned.
But Speakman argues that the three heavens mentioned by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament aren't an executive ranking system for human achievement at all. They are literal dimensions of space.
Right. What's fascinating here is how Speakman interprets Paul's journey. When Paul says he was caught up to the third heaven, Speakman argues this was a literal spatial journey. Paul moved past the atmosphere, through deep space, and straight through that fiery energy barrier.
Wow.
And Speakman insists that the entire purpose of Jesus tearing the veil in the temple was to show that all believers have immediate, equal access straight past that physical energy barrier into the third heaven.
So no VIP sections.
Exactly. It is based entirely on the covenant, not human works.
Hmm.
In his view, there are no restricted tiers in the afterlife at all. It is one unified family standing before one throne, having crossed the spatial boundary.
Okay, so that establishes the boundaries of the universe on day one. The pavilion is built, but if the cosmos is just an empty, dark pavilion at this point, how does the Earth actually form? Because this brings up day two, where the Genesis text says God separates the waters above from the waters below.
Yeah, day two is mechanically fascinating in this book.
Speakman envisions this not just as like making clouds in the sky and oceans on Earth. He sees it as an expanding circular layer of water moving outward into the void.
Yes, the expanse here is interpreted by Speakman as the creation of outer space itself. So the water above the expanse is this massive, expanding ring of water pushing outward, literally enlarging the boundaries of the universe.
Okay.
And the water under the expanse is left in the center, forming this spinning, formless ball of water which will eventually become the Earth. And because this universal expansion is happening so incredibly rapidly, Speakman introduces a critical physical mechanism here: extreme gravitational pull.
And this is where we really have to talk about how he explains geological time, because this is a massive sticking point in these secular versus biblical debates.
It's usually the biggest point of contention, yeah.
Speakman argues that the gravitational force of this rapid universal expansion on day two was so intense that it actually compressed time and physical processes on Earth.
This is where we need to dive into the how of his argument.
Yes.
Speakman is essentially utilizing a concept akin to gravitational time dilation, which is rooted in Einstein's theory of relativity. Einstein proved that gravity actually bends space-time.
Right.
If you have intense concentration of gravity, time moves slower for the observer in that gravity well compared to someone outside of it.
Like the movie Interstellar. They go down to that planet with the massive gravitational pull, and 1 hour there equals, what, 7 years back on Earth?
That is a perfect analogy. Speakman is applying this exact concept to the macro level of day two. He argues that this immense, catastrophic universal expansion centralized a massive gravitational pull right around the Earth. The physical laws were operating under extreme, high-velocity conditions set by the architect.
So time was moving differently.
Exactly. Therefore, what secular science views today as requiring billions of years of slow, uniform erosion, like the carving of the Grand Canyon or the formation of those massive sedimentary rock layers, Speakman claims happened in mere hours under these extreme gravitational pressures.
Just hours.
Yes. He argues that secular scientists are looking at the Earth with an assumption of uniformitarianism. That's the idea that natural processes have always ticked at the exact same speed they do today. Speakman says, no, the clock was ticking drastically differently during the initial construction phase of the universe.
Okay, so if the physical stage is being set with this intense speed and gravitational energy, what is happening behind the scenes? Speakman points out that this physical construction project wasn't happening in a vacuum. It had a simultaneous spiritual component. The stage was being set for a cosmic conflict. I mean, if the cosmos is built, who is inhabiting it?
Well, to understand the conflict, we have to go back to day one for a second. Speakman notes that when God commanded the light boundary to flash into being, he simultaneously populated the spiritual dimension. The angels, which are referred to in the ancient book of Job as the morning stars, were created on day one.
The morning stars.
Right. They were designed to be perfect reflections of God's pristine, holy light dwelling in his immediate presence up in the third heaven.
But then comes the fracture. Lucifer, He wants his own throne. And because God had insulated his uncreated light within the third heaven, Lucifer and his followers were cast out. They were thrown down into the physical darkness of the lower heavens, into that dark pavilion inside the universe.
And in doing so, Spiegman explains, they transformed what was just empty physical darkness in the universe into an active spiritual domain of rebellion and blindness.
Now, I have to push back here on behalf of you, the listener. Because if God is light and Lucifer rules the darkness, does this mean darkness is equal to light in this framework? Are we talking about a cosmic yin and yang where good and evil are locked in an eternal equal struggle for the universe? Because that sounds like dualism, which traditionally biblical theology absolutely rejects.
That is an excellent point of pushback, and it raises a crucial theological question that Spiegman addresses. He's very careful to clarify this. No, it is absolutely not an equal struggle.
Okay, how does he frame it?
Spiegman frames this entire conflict as a highly structured legal victory. Darkness has absolutely no legal right or physical power to extinguish the uncreated light. Remember the architecture we discussed. The original boundary drawn on day one, separating the light from the darkness via that cosmic wall, that was an act of spiritual justice.
So God didn't just build a wall, he enforced a jurisdiction.
Precisely. God insulated his throne room and his physical creation so that while darkness might prowl within the confines of the universe, it is legally confined, it is quarantined. The victory of God's glory over spiritual rebellion wasn't something that happens at the end of time, Stickmin argues. It was written into the very architecture of the cosmos on the first day.
Wow. And Speakman makes a brief but really fascinating point about the Garden of Eden acting as the first temple in this grand design, right?
It is, yeah.
It's described as a place where the physical and spiritual perfectly intersected before the fall of man broke that connection. But after the fall, humanity is plunged into this degraded world, fully exposed to this spiritual rebellion. And Speakman connects this legal spiritual battle directly to the historical time of Jesus.
This is a major connection in the book.
Yeah, he notes that leading up to Jesus' arrival, the spiritual realm was incredibly chaotic. If you read ancient texts, demons were causing absolute havoc in human lives, and people were trying in vain to remove them with all sorts of rituals and incantations. Why was this historical oppression allowed to get so bad?
Speakman argues this intense spiritual oppression was permitted for a very specific legal reason. It was so that when the Messiah finally arrived on the stage, his absolute cosmic authority would be mathematically undeniable.
Undeniable how?
Well, for hundreds of years, humans struggled against these entities, proving their complete inability to alter the spiritual legalities. They could not evict the darkness. But Jesus, stepping onto the scene, could cast out demons with a single word.
Because he isn't just a prophet in Speakman's framework, he is the creator enforcing his own rules.
Exactly. Let's explain the why here. Speakman's point is that only the creator, the one who set the original legal boundaries of the spiritual realm on day one, the one who built a pavilion, possessed the cosmic authority to revoke a spirit's permission to occupy a physical space or a human heart.
So it's about property rights.
Yes. When Jesus cast out a demon with a simple command, it wasn't just a localized miracle of healing, it was legal proof of his divinity. He was enforcing the boundary lines he himself drew at the dawn of time. He was demonstrating that he owned the house.
That is a completely fascinating way to frame the miracles in the New Testament, not just as compassion, but as legal cosmic enforcement. But, this raises a huge question.
What's that?
If the cosmos is built, the spiritual legal boundaries are drawn, and the conflict is raging, how does humanity actually survive the fallout of this conflict on Earth without losing the original blueprint? Like, how do we get from the Garden of Eden to Jesus without the entire human story being swallowed by darkness?
That is exactly where the human actors enter the stage. Speakman places immense importance on genealogies to answer that question.
Genealogies.
The begats.
Yes, the begats. Often modern readers just skim right past those lists of names in ancient texts. But Speakman doesn't view the lineage from Adam to Seth to Noah as just a dry roll call of family history. He sees it as a spiritual lineage flowing like an unstoppable river through time.
A golden thread of memory.
Yes. In a world that the text describes as rapidly falling into total darkness and violence leading up to the flood, the specific unbroken line preserves memory, it preserves identity, and it preserves divine purpose. It's proof the plan wasn't lost.
Exactly. It is the proof that God's design wasn't erased by human failure. The blueprint was being actively carried forward, protected within this specific family line.
And this lineage survives the global flood, narrowing down to a massive genetic and spiritual bottleneck, right? Just Noah and his family. But shortly after the flood, humanity hits another massive fracture point, the Tower of Babel. Humanity tries to build a centralized tower to the heavens, and God responds by confusing their languages and dividing them into clans, scattering them across the earth.
Right. And Speakman traces how these scattered clans formed the major ancient civilizations we know today. For example, he points out that Noah's son Ham had a son named Mizraim. Interestingly, Mizraim is actually the Hebrew word for Egypt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that specific lineage migrated and settled the Nile Valley. Another son, Canaan, settled the region that would become modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Syria. These clans, moving away from the original blueprint, became ongoing historical threats to the lineage of promise.
But the golden thread, the preserved memory, runs through Noah's other son, Shem. And Speakman follows a fascinating linguistic trail here. He points out that while the world was divided and confused at Babel, Shem and his descendant Eber retained the original primeval language.
This is a crucial linguistic connection Speakman makes, and it's why the book focuses heavily on that linguistic grit we talked about earlier, because Shem and Eber lived for hundreds of years after the flood. Due to the slow degradation of their biological lifespans, which we'll discuss shortly, they acted as living, breathing libraries of the pre-Babel, pre-flood world.
They were the ancient historians.
Exactly. Speakman notes that the word Hebrew directly derives from the name Eber. Therefore, this specific branch of the family retained the original language, the original history, and the original identity. This linguistic trail leads directly to Abraham, who is the first person in the biblical text explicitly called the Hebrew.
Now, here is where Speakman drops a massive historical connection that I really need you to unpack because it involves some serious timeline overlap. Speakman argues that Shem, who survived the flood, is actually the mysterious biblical figure Melchizedek.
Yes, he does.
I need to push back here. Shem lived hundreds of years after the flood. Secular historians and modern science would argue those lifespans are purely mythical. How does Speakman justify a guy from the Ark surviving long enough to hand Abraham bread and wine?
That's a vital question. In Speakman's framework, biological decay post-flood wasn't instantaneous. It was a compounding curve of genetic entropy.
A curve.
Right, so Noah's immediate sons still possessed a highly robust pre-flood genetic code. So mathematically, according to the chronologies provided in the Genesis text, Shem outlived many of his own descendants and was indeed still alive during the lifetime of Abraham.
So he was basically the ancient, revered patriarch of the entire surviving human race.
Exactly. Now, Melchizedek's name translates to King of Righteousness, and the text says he was the king of Salem, which historically becomes Jerusalem. Speakman argues that Shem, as the absolute eldest surviving patriarch of the New World, held the position of the original family priest. He was the guardian of the original covenant.
The scene where they meet is just so cinematic when you view it this way. Abraham has just returned from chasing down multiple armies to rescue his nephew Lot. He is exhausted, he's fought a massive battle over 100 miles, and Melchizedek, who Speakman identifies as Abraham's ancient grandfather Shem, comes out of his enclave to meet him, offering him bread and wine.
Which Speakman immediately identifies as a direct prophetic foreshadowing of Jesus offering the bread and wine at the Last Supper. It is a profound gesture of providing for both the physical exhaustion and the spiritual needs of the faithful. The old world handing the baton to the new.
But why does this specific identification matter so much? Why is Shem being Melchizedek a cornerstone of Speakman's argument for the rest of biblical history?
We have to look at the how of biblical law to understand this. It establishes a vital legal precedent for everything that follows. Hundreds of years later in history, under the law of Moses, the Israelites were strictly divided by tribal roles.
Right, the tribes.
Kings had to come from the tribe of Judah, and priests had to come from the tribe of Levi. You absolutely could not be both. But Melchizedek represents a priesthood of the firstborn from the pre-flood world. It is a higher, older, more universal priesthood that supersedes the later Levitical law.
And this solves a massive legal loophole for Jesus, because Jesus wasn't from the priestly tribe of Levi, he was from the kingly tribe of Judah.
Precisely. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament makes a massive point of stating that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Speakman explains that this means Jesus holds a higher, older authority that doesn't depend on Levitical tribal birthright. Shem, being Melchizedek, sets the ancient legal precedent for Jesus to be the ultimate high priest and the king simultaneously, bypassing the temporary restrictions of the Mosaic law.
That is brilliant. And speaking of that kingly tribe of Judah, Speakman tracks that genetic and legal lineage directly to Jesus to show how every ancient promise is fulfilled perfectly, like a multi-generational puzzle snapping into place. He looks back at the patriarch Jacob blessing his son Judah, prophesying that the scepter, which he identifies as Shiloh or the Messiah, would not depart from him. How does Speakman trace this through the notoriously confusing genealogies of Jesus?
This is where Speakman's attention to detail really shines. He points out how the two different genealogies of Jesus provided in the Gospels flawlessly execute this ancient promise from two different angles. The Gospel of Matthew traces the legal kingly right.
The legal right, okay.
Yes, it follows the line through Joseph, going back through King Solomon, David, all the way to Judah. Now, Joseph wasn't Jesus' biological father, but under ancient Hebrew legal dwelling laws, Joseph adopting Jesus gave him the absolute legal right to the throne of David.
But the Gospel of Luke traces a completely different path. It goes through a bunch of names we don't even recognize.
Right, because Luke traces the biological bloodline. He traces the line through Mary, going back through a different son of David named Nathan, all the way back to Judah and eventually to Adam.
And why is the biological line so important if the legal one is secured by Joseph?
Because of the very first promise made in the Garden of Eden. God promised that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Jesus had to be the physical, biological descendant of Eve through Judah and David to fulfill the prophecy. Speakman shows how both the strict legal requirements and the biological requirements of the ancient prophecies converge perfectly on Jesus through this unbroken thread.
It is incredibly intricate. But this brings us to a much darker reality in the text. While the spiritual inheritance of Noah's family was perfectly preserved through this lineage, their biological inheritance was fundamentally falling apart.
Yes, it was degrading rapidly.
If we look at the timeline Speakman provides, we see this pristine creation plunging into chaos. This brings us to what is, in my opinion, one of the most gripping and relevant scientific arguments in Speakman's framework: post-flood biological entropy and ghost lineages.
It is a profound shift in perspective, especially regarding how we view human health and ancestry today. Speakman posits that Adam and Eve were created with what he calls a flawless supergenome.
What does he mean by supergenome? Because normally we think of the first humans as primitive, maybe genetically simple.
Speakman argues the exact opposite. They didn't have a minimalist, primitive genetic code. They possessed the maximal genetic potential. Their DNA contained the alleles, the gene variants, to produce every single variation of human trait we see today across all populations.
All of them.
All of them. Eye color, height, skin tone, bone structure. All of it was packed into this original, perfect blueprint. This flawless genome, operating in a pristine, unpolluted pre-flood environment, allowed for immense diversity within their offspring. It also allowed for those incredibly long lifespans of nearly 1,000 years that we see in Genesis, because they had virtually zero genetic load.
Meaning no accumulated mutations or copying errors.
Exactly.
But then comes the flood, and Speakman describes the flood not just as a catastrophic water event that reshaped the geology of the Earth, but as a catastrophic genetic filter, a bottleneck.
Yes, the concept of genetic bottleneck is crucial here. Imagine a massive, globally diverse population of millions of people. Suddenly, in a single catastrophic event, humanity is reduced down to just 8 people walking off the ark.
Let me try to break down the how of this genetic bottleneck with an analogy. Imagine God takes a flawless, incredibly high-resolution digital photograph of humanity. It's vibrant, every pixel is perfect. That's Adam and Eve. But then the flood happens. That massive file gets compressed into a tiny, low-resolution JPEG. Only a fraction of the original data survives. Then, generation after generation, that same JPEG gets downloaded, resaved, and photocopied over and over for thousands of years. With every generation, the file loses a little more structural data. It gets pixelated, it degrades, the colors fade.
That is an excellent analogy. In genetics, this is called genetic drift and the loss of heterozygosity. When a population shrinks drastically, rare gene variants are lost forever. Speakman is arguing that we, modern humans, are living on the tail end of a copy of a copy of a copy. The structural integrity of the human body is buckling under the weight of thousands of years of systemic genetic decay. He refers to this as genetic entropy, the biological reality that the human genome is winding down, not evolving upward.
And he uses this concept of a genetic bottleneck to explain one of the most fascinating mysteries in modern anthropology right now: ghost lineages. Can you explain what a ghost lineage is in secular science, and then how Speakman flips it?
Certainly. In recent years, secular geneticists have sequenced the DNA of certain modern West African populations. When they analyzed it, they found deep, ancient genetic signatures that are radically different from European, Asian, or even other African signatures.
Okay.
The evolutionary assumption is that this DNA must have come from an ancient, primitive hominin ancestor who interbred with humans. But here's the problem. There are absolutely no matching fossil bones in the ground in West Africa to explain who these ancestors were.
Right.
No skulls, no skeletons.
Nothing.
Nothing. So scientists label them an unknown archaic ghost species. They see the genetic shadow, but they can't find the body.
And Speakman looks at the exact same genetic data, but reads the X-ray completely differently.
Yeah.
How does he explain the ghost lineage through his biblical framework?
Speakman argues that this isn't an unknown primitive species at all. First, he tackles a lack of fossils using a very specific scientific concept called taphonomic bias.
Okay, let's unpack taphonomic bias for the listener, because that sounds like heavy academic jargon. What is the mechanism there?
Taphonomy is simply the study of how organisms decay and become fossilized over time. Fossilization is actually incredibly rare.
Yeah.
You need very specific conditions, usually a rapid burial in an anoxic environment like a mudslide, where oxygen can't reach the body. This allows minerals to slowly replace the bone over time.
But West Africa isn't a mudslide.
Exactly. The tropical environment of West Africa is a rainforest ecosystem. It has highly acidic soil, heavy rainfall, high humidity, and massive microbial and scavenging action. If an animal or a human dies on a rainforest floor, the bones dissolve and are recycled by the ecosystem incredibly fast.
So they just vanish.
Right. The unique conditions required for fossilization simply weren't present for those ancient populations in that region. So the physical bones were erased by the environment. That is taphonomic bias.
So the lack of fossils makes perfect scientific sense. But if they aren't a ghost species, where did this unique, deep DNA signature come from?
Speakman traces it straight back to the Tower of Babel. When humanity's language was confused and they scattered across the globe, they broke into small, isolated family groups. A group migrating toward West Africa carried a specific, highly unique subset of that rich, pre-flood genetic thumbprint.
Oh, I see.
Perhaps dominant traits that simply weren't present in the groups that migrated north to Europe or east to Asia. Because secular scientists operate on an evolutionary timeline of millions of years, they assume this different DNA must equal a different, older species. But Speakman argues it is simply the preserved, isolated, perfectly human genetics of Noah's descendants.
He flips the narrative entirely. The DNA isn't evolving upward from a primitive ghost. It's a fragmented, isolated piece of a once perfect, highly diverse whole.
Exactly.
And he applies this exact same logic of genetic fragmentation to the biblical accounts of giants, which is why we're talking about the Anakim, the Raphael, and Goliath. Speakman says these weren't magical, mythical creatures out of a fantasy novel.
Right. He approaches giants from a purely biological standpoint. Speakman explains giants as the rare expression of recessive pre-flood genes for massive physical stature. In the pristine pre-flood world, a 9 or 12-foot frame was perfectly supported. The supergenome provided the necessary bone density and cardiovascular strength, and the environment itself, perhaps different atmospheric pressures or higher oxygen levels, supported that massive growth.
But post-flood, the environment collapsed and the genome bottlenecked.
Exactly.
And this is where you brought in some intense physics in your notes on the book that really made this click for me. The square-cube law. Let's explain how this law works and why it spells doom for giants in a post-flood world.
The square-cube law is a fundamental principle of geometry and biomechanics. It dictates that as a shape grows in size, its volume, and therefore its weight, grows much faster than its surface area.
Okay, break that down for me physically.
So if you double a human's height, their weight doesn't just double, it multiplies by a factor of 8. However, the cross-sectional area of their bones, muscles, and ligaments, which determines their structural strength, only multiplies by a factor of 4.
So the bigger you get, the fundamentally weaker your structure becomes relative to your sheer mass. Your weight outpaces your bone strength.
Exactly. A 9-foot frame in our current degraded environment is subjected to brutal gravitational and biomechanical stress. The bones can't support the weight, the heart struggles to pump blood that high, and the joints degrade rapidly. Speakman uses a deeply poignant, modern illustrative example here to drive the reality of this home. The tragic reality of the professional wrestler Andre the Giant.
Right. Andre the Giant suffered from acromegaly, a hormonal disorder that caused him to grow to over 7 feet tall. He was famous, but he was in constant crushing pain, right?
He was. His joints, his knees, and his spine were literally collapsing under his own weight as he aged. because a modern human body isn't structurally optimized for a 7.5-foot frame. He required massive surgeries just to function.
So sad.
Speakman uses the tragic reality of Andre to explain the physical suffering of the biblical giants like Goliath or the Anakim. They weren't majestic warriors. They were tragic figures. They were an ancient pre-flood blueprint trying to play out on a broken post-flood stage.
Wow.
The judgment of the flood didn't magically rewrite their DNA. It broke the world around them, turning what was once a majestic pre-flood stature into a genetic curse of intense structural pain.
It's a completely tragic way to look at it, but it makes so much sense within the physics of his framework. It grounds the mythology into harsh biological reality. And, this genetic degradation isn't just an ancient problem frozen in time with giants and ghost lineages. Speakman argues it is actively compounding today, right on our dinner plate. This brings us to how Speakman connects this cosmic and ancient history to our modern health crisis.
Speakman is quite stark in his assessment of our modern world. He argues that humanity is taking its already fragile, entropically degraded post-flood bodies and rapidly accelerating the genetic damage by fueling them with artificial industrial chemistry.
He gets very specific in the text about this. We aren't eating directly from the soil like our ancient ancestors. We are walking through supermarkets consuming synthetic preservatives, forever plastics, artificial food dyes, engineered flavor stabilizers.
And if you connect this to his overarching thesis of the supergenome degrading into a fragile copy, the why becomes clear. The modern human body, which is already operating on a weakened blueprint with lost structural data, was absolutely never designed to process these synthetic industrial inputs.
It just doesn't know what to do with them.
Right. Our livers, our kidneys, our cellular structures, they don't have the ancestral coding to deal with microplastics. Furthermore, he points out that we are breathing polluted skies, drinking water contaminated with heavy metals, and dealing with chemical rain. All of this environmental toxicity aggressively compounds the inherited biological stress.
So, what does this all mean for us today? What is the practical result of pouring synthetic preservatives into a degrading genetic blueprint?
Speakman concludes that the modern health crisis is the visible, heartbreaking manifestation of this compounding decay. He points to the skyrocketing rates of autoimmune diseases, systemic inflammation, metabolic syndromes, and chronic fatigue.
So these aren't just random illnesses.
In his view, no. These aren't random evolutionary glitches. They occur because our immune systems, confused and overwhelmed by synthetic toxins and a lack of baseline structural data, essentially panic. They begin to attack the very bodies they were designed to protect.
He even points to the heartbreaking increase in birth deformities and developmental hurdles in modern times. Secular science might view these as random statistical anomalies or the result of environmental factors alone, but Speakman frames them as the stark biological reality of our DNA losing its grip. It's getting harder and harder for the original design to replicate perfectly in a highly toxic, hostile world. We are an ancient blueprint running out of steam, desperately trying to build a house with damaged materials in a hurricane of artificial chemistry.
And in a world physically running down like this, where our bodies are failing and the environment is hostile, and physical suffering is just inevitable, Speakman doesn't shy away from this at all. He addresses the reality of this pain by exploring the biblical story of Job.
Job, the ultimate story of suffering.
Right. Now, historically, Speakman suggests that Job's story is incredibly ancient, likely recorded in an early post-Babel cousin language to Hebrew, and eventually passed down through the lineage of Shem and Jacob to be included in the biblical record.
Job is arguably the ultimate literary exploration of suffering. He loses his family, his wealth, and then his health. The text says his body is covered in agonizing physical sores from head to toe. But Speakman highlights a very specific, practical detail from the ancient texts that I had never truly considered before.
It's a very easily missed detail.
He points out that Job took a piece of broken pottery and used ash from the fire to scrape and soothe his physical sores, trying to dry them out and keep the flies away.
It is a profound detail, and Speakman uses it to show immense grace toward the human condition. He emphasizes that Job did what he practically needed to do to ease his sheer physical agony, and that doing so seeking relief is not a sin. It highlights the brutal reality of enduring physical decay without cursing the Creator.
It's a vital lesson. Speakman is basically saying, in a broken, entropic world, whether you are dealing with a migraine, cancer, an autoimmune flare-up, or the agonizing sores of Job, seeking relief for your physical suffering is part of navigating our degraded biological state.
Yes.
Using modern medicine, changing your diet, or sitting in ashes, it's all an attempt to soothe the broken vessel.
Precisely. Speakman's point is that the physical decay is a baked-in reality of the post-flood world. The key, as modeled by Job, is enduring that weight, enduring the entropy, without losing faith in the architect who holds the original blueprint. Job suffered immensely, but he recognized that the legal and cosmic authority still rested with God.
Wow. Okay, let's pull all of these massive threads together because the sheer scale of Speakman's vision in creation through art is just staggering when you lay it all out like this.
It truly is a highly unified framework. We've gone from the cosmic microwave background radiation at the fiery, literal edge of the observable universe on day one, all the way down to the microplastics and synthetic preservatives degrading our modern food supply today.
And we bridge that massive gap by tracing the ancient, unbroken lineage of Melchizedek and the tragic physics of the square-cube law acting on post-flood giants.
It challenges the secular narrative of upward evolution at every single turn. Instead of humanity slowly climbing out of the primordial soup to become better and stronger, Speakman presents a picture of a pristine, maximally diverse creation that was shattered. A world that is currently groaning under the compounding weight of genetic entropy, just awaiting its ultimate restoration.
And we must return to Speakman's stated ultimate goal with all of this density, all of this linguistic grit. Why build this massive model? He wants to remove spiritual paranoia.
Yes.
He wants to prove to you, the reader, that if you are a believer, you are a sealed temple. Because the creator, the one who spoke the energy walls of space into existence and drew the legal boundaries of the spirit realm, has secured your blueprint. Therefore, darkness has absolutely no legal right or physical power to squat in your life.
The king is on the throne in the third heaven. The physical and spiritual mechanics of the lower heavens are completely accounted for, and the believer is eternally safe within that architecture.
It is a massive amount of information to chew on, whether you agree with his theological and scientific conclusions or not. It undeniably makes you look at the world, your body, and the sky completely differently. So, we want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over based on the framework we've explored today.
I think this is the perfect question to end on.
If the ghost lineages hidden deep in West African DNA and the literal fiery edge of the observable universe both point backward to the exact same ancient, highly structured starting line, what other unexplained scientific anomalies in our modern world are simply waiting for us to read the original blueprint to finally understand them? Think about that the next time you look up at the night sky.